Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. Such a wonderful time of the week for us to get together, talk some gardening, and just share this wonderful community. Shout out to Anna and Petrus. Thank you for those wonderful words that you started the comment section with today. I appreciate it very much. I'm always so glad to help all gardeners, everybody, even if they're not gardeners, in any way I can. I just think it's so nice that we can do this as gardeners, helping each other with gardening. It's one of those things that I think many of us get into gardening to have something to do. Maybe we want to grow food, maybe we want to grow shower or flowers or whatever it happens to be. And then we find out that we really like it. We might not be good at it, but we really like it. And so we keep doing it. And we get better by talking with other gardeners, by sharing information, by learning from all of the wonderful resources that are out there. And along the way, hopefully, as we learn more, we get that opportunity to share even more with the others that kind of need our guidance, that need our experience, that can benefit from all that information that we can share. Today's show is going to be about what to do in fall, because I think fall, as the seasons go, is one of those gardening times of year that maybe we don't do it the best way, that we discover with experience and maybe some of that mentorship from other gardeners that fall may end up being the most important season on our calendar. But it takes us a while to get to that point, to figure it out. So I'll be asking for your input, of course, all along the way in today's show. But I want to share with you some things to do in fall, but more importantly, the concept of using fall as the time of year to really prepare your garden for spring, for summer, even for winter. It's the time of year that I think really makes a difference in how we approach our gardening season and what we're going to do to make everything work from that point forward. I've got some visual issues going on. I think I've got that fixed now. So, what does fall mean to you? For new gardeners, as I began the thought process, we're focused on growing the plants, on harvesting if we're growing for food, and then we kind of look at the end of the season as the end of the season. We've harvested, the cold has come. Some of you have already commented that you've got freezing weather in your forecast. I did that for a long time. As soon as the freezing weather hit, I was done gardening for the year. The plants were dead. I eventually got to cleaning up the garden, but it was over until the next year. And I'd like you to start thinking that fall is actually a new beginning. I plan a lot of what I'm going to grow next year in fall. I prepare my garden for what I'm growing next year in fall. In fall, I'm analyzing all of the things that happened over the course of the growing season to relish in the satisfaction of having some wonderful accomplishments and successes, or trying to point out those things that didn't quite go right that maybe I can learn from and improve for next year. And so this is a busy time of year, even with freezing weather coming, and knock on wood, I don't have any in my forecast. With the cold comes maybe the death of plants, but it doesn't mean that it's the death of your gardening season or any of the gardening activities that need to take place in your garden. So, a lot of discussion on that. Of course, I'll take any questions along those lines. So nice to see everybody here. Hello to Riza in Tehran. That's fantastic. and from Israel as well. This is just fantastic. And of course, the first comment today was from Sweden. So when I say this is a global audience, it really is a global audience, and we're all confronting these issues. Now, I live in a region that has 4 distinct seasons. My fall has cool temperatures. It starts to freeze about 2 weeks from now. In the middle of October is typically when I get my first frost of the season. That rolls into winter, where I actually get snow, and there are days that never rise above freezing. And then, of course, there's springtime with gradually increasing temperatures. Everything starts waking up again. And then, of course, in summer, I get very hot, dry temperatures. And then the cycle repeats over again. You may not have those 4 distinct cycles. You may have more of a continual pattern. I talk a lot with Eli in Scotland about weather. And in Scotland, they don't get very cold and they don't get very hot. Their entire year follows a relatively narrow band of temperatures. It's still cold in winter and it's still warm in summer. And those patterns, however extreme they might be for you, can set the pace for your gardening year. And so I use the calendar and I use the seasons as I figure out what needs to be done in the garden. It's relatively easy for me because the weather often directs what the activities are going to be. But if you don't have some of those extremes, if you live in a region like Israel, for instance, where maybe you don't have the same type of extremes with the snow that I have, but maybe you have the extremes of the heat, it's still the same basic process. Use the calendar to determine what your activities are going to be at different times of the year. Science Save, hello to you, says, I'm in zone 7. Is it possible to plant bare root apple trees at the beginning of fall, or should I wait until spring? So, great question. And this starts us right into some of those activities that I think fall is very good for. Now, planting trees is actually great to do in fall. And there have been actual studies, some research, university research that deals with this topic, whether it's best to plant in spring or whether it's best to plant in fall, as far as the trees are concerned, and bushes and shrubs. And so the basic idea and the basic support for planting in fall is that the temperatures are cooling. And so when you put a new plant in the ground, there's going to be stress on that plant. When you get away from the heat of summer, and so the temperatures are cooling, you put a tree in the ground and the stress is less. The tree actually is able to get in the ground and not have to deal with that scorching sun that might happen if you plant in spring. So when you plant a tree in spring, it is increasing temperatures, and just about the time that the tree is starting to send out some roots and really get established, now the sun sets in, and a young tree can be very stressed by the extreme temperatures of summer. You don't have as much of that in fall. You might have some cold, but as long as you're choosing the right kind of trees for your region, the cold is not as much a stress on a plant as the heat is. And so those roots that might actually be hindered going into summer are not hindered in fall. As long as the soil is not frozen, those roots are going to continue to grow. And so some of the research I've seen shows that the root development of a early fall planted tree is actually more in those first critical months than a late spring planted tree. So for establishing a tree, fall is really good. Now, however, we get to an important difference in the type of trees we're planting. So when you are planting a potted tree, there are already leaves on the tree. The roots are already active. And when you put a potted tree in the ground, the roots can grow immediately. There's photosynthesis from the leaves. And for fall planting, potted trees do best. If you can find a bare root tree, and most bare root trees are sold in spring, if you can find a bare root tree, it's not as good an idea to plant that in fall because the tree has to wake up, the leaves have to develop, that energy has to go to the roots, and then the roots will anchor the tree. But in fall, with the cooling temperatures, the leaves are going to be falling from the tree. So bare root trees do better in spring because you're planting them when they're dormant. You're not going to get that initial root development when you put a bare root tree in because it's sleeping. But as soon as it wakes up, as soon as the temperatures increase, the buds break, the leaves develop, now the roots will grow very quickly. They're in the ground. There's no stress on that tree because it was dormant when you planted it. So lots of information about when to plant tree. It basically comes down to bare root trees do best in spring and potted trees do best in fall. And so fall, when we think about what we're going to be doing as far as planting bulbs, and I've talked about this in recent weeks as well, specifically with a focus on garlic. Fall is a great time to put in the bulbs that will be flowering in spring, or like the alliums that will be harvesting in late spring, maybe summer, depending on what it is. For an onion that you want to grow, you can actually plant those onions in fall for harvest next year. Just like we plant shallots and we plant garlic in fall for harvest next year. But do the same with your hyacinth and your tulips and your crocus. Those are all planted in fall as dormant bulbs or corms, and the soil that is still warm, that hasn't frozen yet, give all those bulbs an opportunity to start some of that root development. That's a big reason why we plant them in fall, because the root development is happening underground. Even though you don't see the plant, the roots are growing. And then the soil gets cold and it sends them back into dormancy. So all the energy that's being held within that bulb is retained for springtime. Now, in springtime, with the warming temperatures, the energy in the bulb sends up the shoots of the new plant. There's already some root development from fall, and now the plants can take off and do great in spring and even flower in that first year of planting for many of those bulbs. So think about the plants that you want to have in your garden. And if it's something that can benefit from fall planting, then do it. One of the things I love about fall, especially when we talk about potted trees and potted bushes in particular, is that a lot of nurseries are having sales on the plants that should be planted in fall. It's the end of the season for them. They want to reduce their inventory going into winter. And so you can get some great bargains on perennial plants. I love going to the garden center. My garden center is pretty much already shut down for the year here, but nurseries are still open. And a lot of those plants that are fading, the perennial plants that have no blooms on them anymore, maybe the leaves are starting to fall off or brown, and you can pick those up for a fraction of what they charge when the plant is in full bloom. That's awesome. Get those plants that look straggly, that look like they're struggling. They're just getting ready to go into dormancy. And so it's a lot like planting a bulb, where we put these perennial potted plants that we get for a bargain in the ground. There is already some root development. They might send out some more roots because the soil is warm. You're not going to get any flowers, but that's not why you're doing it. You're doing it for next year. And so mums right now, chrysanthemums are being sold in my local stores and nurseries. This is a great time of year to get mums. Don't spend a lot of money on the ones that are in full bloom right now. Go ahead and wait a week or two when they are struggling and they look bad, and pick them up and put them in the ground for next year. That's a great fall activity and one that I really think can be important. Sean is asking, can you talk about fall versus spring pruning, specifically for newly established fruit trees? And so fall is really not a time of year that we typically are pruning trees. There's really two times of year that are really best for pruning fruit trees, and that's winter and summer. And so the reason that those are the two primary periods is because of what's happening with the branches as they grow and the way that the buds grow and the auxins, the chemicals that actually can direct the way that the branch is growing. And so when we are pruning for the structure of a tree, if we want an open vase type of structure or a central leader type of structure, and I talk about this in a few of my videos, that type of pruning is done in winter when the tree is dormant. And we will prune very close to a bud. And as the tree wakes up, that bud now becomes the leader of growth for that branch. And so you can definitely train the direction of the tree based on winter pruning. For summer pruning, it's a completely different action as far as the tree is concerned. When we prune off a branch, a tip, a portion, most of the branch, it's causing a different reaction in the tree. It actually causes more of a bushiness to develop. And so in the winter pruning, we're directing the branch. In the summer pruning, we're actually creating more of uh, a robust tree with more leaves developing at that point of pruning. And with fruit trees, especially after a couple years when they get established, when you do some of that pruning in summer, like with apple trees, you can actually stimulate that branch that you have just pruned to become a fruiting spur. And so it's two distinct different reasons for pruning versus with the summer versus the winter pruning. Now, at any time of year, you can prune off the dead, the damaged, and what I call the disorderly branches. And so the dead and damaged or diseased branches, those can and often should be pruned off in fall. As soon as the leaves fall off and you can see the branches that don't need to be on the tree anymore. Maybe, like has happened to me recently, the deer found the tree and ate off some of the tips. Go ahead and prune off those tips so you have a nice clean tip going into the winter versus that ragged deer eaten tip. When you leave the ragged edges on the branches, you're just inviting pests, you're inviting diseases. And fall can be a good time of year to prune off some of those type of issues with your tree, where you want the tree going into winter as strong and as healthy as possible. So get rid of some of those branches that don't need to be there anymore. But for newly established fruit trees, generally what we want to do is train the structure of the tree, and that's best done in very late winter, maybe early spring, before the tree has awoken from its dormancy. And I've got some videos on how I prune my young fruit trees, and I'm sure Jay will be right on top of it and put those in place if she hasn't already. I appreciate that. Mobius 981 is saying, I would like to plant my raspberry volunteers in October. Question mark. Yes, you can. I I prefer to move my raspberry volunteers in spring, and it's the same basic idea. It's trying to get the plants when they're dormant or just beginning to wake up, and then I'll transplant them to a new area so that as they wake up and start sending the new roots, the new roots, they're in their new home. You can do it in fall. And so I did a video recently where I was transplanting strawberries. And so strawberries and raspberries actually can do quite well by digging up those volunteers and transplanting in spring. And it's for the same reason I was talking about with the trees earlier. If you get them in the ground without that added stress of the high summer temperatures, it gives them a chance to get established before the cold weather comes. I do one thing differently when I do the fall transplanting like this. So in spring, when I dig up my raspberries and move them to a new area, I just put them in place. I know they're going to grow. I know that they're going to be established by summer. I will mulch the plants, but I just mulch the same as everything else. In fall, the plants aren't completely established yet, and they're still undergoing some of that transplant shock. And so, while I don't normally do a really deep layer of mulch around my raspberries and strawberries, for the fall transplanted plants, I do a thicker mulch. I want to help protect the plant a little bit more. I want the soil temperature and the soil moisture to be more moderate while those plants are getting established. And you can do that with a thicker mulch. So uh, I would say do both. This is one of the ways that you determine which you prefer. I prefer transplanting my raspberries in spring because I can see all of the new ones popping up at the end because they're going to be sending out roots in fall. So even if you do a fall transplanting, you're still going to have more volunteers pop up in spring that you didn't even know were there because all those roots are developing underground as we speak. But you can do it in fall. So take some of those volunteers and transplant them in fall, and then wait until spring and transplant some of those volunteers in spring and see which one you prefer. I think that's a viable option for both and will help you determine really what it is you want to do. Uh, and as you do this, so this is a great time of year. And like I say, there's so many different activities that you can be doing in fall. One of them is seed collecting. I've got a whole bunch of videos on collecting different seeds, on fall sowing of seeds, on winter sowing of seeds. A lot of that starts right now. So I've got my cosmos, the flowers that are popping up right now. I grew cosmos from seed, I think 3 years ago. And that was it. I put those plants in the ground. Now, every year I have cosmos popping up at this time of year from the seeds that I sowed last year. And when I say sowed, all I did was just wait until the seeds were ready on those plants, just plucked them off those plants, and then just spread them around my garden area. And then they'll grow next year. And so that whole pollinator garden that I have, that's what I do with all of those flowers, from the cone flowers to the black-eyed Susan to the cosmos. Uh, Everything is hand sown. While I'm doing some of this transplanting, while I'm doing the last weeding of the year, I'm taking some of those dried flower heads and then just sprinkling them into open areas that don't have flowers yet. Now, you can be very formal with it. You can identify the plant, you can save the seeds, and you can go ahead and put them into plastic bags or jars or however you're going to save those plants for starting indoors next year. But go ahead and consider just spreading them around the garden and letting the garden become whatever the garden becomes. Whichever plants are the ones that take root literally and grow, those are the ones I think that deserve a place in the garden. So take advantage of the plants that do well in your garden and you spreading them to other areas of your garden because they've already proven themselves as something that is going to work. And I think that can be a great way to really advance your stockpile of seeds for the future, because you're going to have a lot more next year when those flowers grow. Dig into gardening says, I've noticed that some of my trees don't shed leaves in fall, specifically the apples. Do your apples drop their leaves? So it depends. And I live in a very extreme region when fall and winter set in. And so maybe you might see this, and this may be one reason for what's happening. And so the leaves on trees generally are going to get cold at night. The chlorophyll production is going to cease, and then their true color is going to emerge. Then the leaf is going to, or the tree is actually going to shut itself off from that leaf. It's not sending any more energy to it. And so it turns brown, and then it falls from the branch. That's primarily driven by the temperatures and by the decreasing sunlight. And so going into winter, the tree is bare. For some of us, like here in Colorado, we have such extreme temperatures that overnight we'll go from very warm days, sometimes hot days, to extremely cold nights. And so temperature is a factor, a big factor in the leaves falling from the trees. And so I think 2 of the last 3 or 3 of the last 4 years for me here in Colorado, going into October, the leaves are still on the trees. They might be yellow, they might be red, they might be brown, but they're still on the trees. And then we would have an overnight drop of extreme temperatures. Last year, we went from a few frosty nights to 18 degrees overnight, about -8 Celsius, just out of the blue, that cold. Well, that cold of a temperature, that severe cold, will actually cause cellular damage in all those leaves. And so instead of following that natural progression where the tree will be shut off from the branch and then fall, suddenly every branch or every leaf on every branch is killed, and it locks into place. So to answer this question, it depends. Some years the leaves naturally fall. Like this year, the temperatures are still record high. We're going to be record high temperature today, but at night it's decreasing. Some of the leaves are starting to fall, and if this pattern continues, then all my apple tree leaves will fall. But if the patterns of the last couple years hold again, then yeah, some of my leaves will remain on the tree until springtime, because essentially they were killed in place, and that natural mechanism of the leaf falling was completely shut off. So it's not unusual for the leaves to stay on the trees, particularly if you have a drastic temperature change like that. If you're, in a windy area like mine, even a lot of those trees that the leaves stayed on, by the time we had some of those 40 and 50-mile-an-hour windy days in winter and early spring, most of those dead leaves had blown off. But it's not unusual. I think if you were to go back and watch some of my videos from February and March, where I was outside in the garden, you could still see some of the trees with leaves on them that had stayed in place all winter long. So it really isn't that unusual. Brian's Garden says, 3rd attempt to overwinter a damn pepper plant. Any tips? And so the biggest thing about overwinter, there's a few things. So I've been putting together a video. I actually don't have a video on overwintering a pepper, but I'm planning to make one for this year. One thing that's recommended that I think a lot of people don't do is cleaning the plant. The idea being that if there was any pest or disease that might be on that plant, if you just dig up the plant and pot it and bring it indoors, it might be susceptible to whatever was causing issues that might be residing in the soil, a disease or a pest. So you can actually dig up a pepper plant and hose it off, actually clean it. You can actually prune the roots in addition to pruning the branches. Then pot it up and bring it indoors. That way, if there's any issues with diseases and pests, you're eliminating that right off the bat. Putting it into a nice fresh soil is important. It doesn't need to be a rich soil because you're not growing the plant. You just want to protect those roots going into the winter. And so a big issue that I've seen people make is they pot up the pepper plant, overwinter it, and then they water it too much. And in the process, you are causing the roots to die because the soil is too saturated. So that could be an issue. Try to keep the soil on the dry side rather than on the wet side. And prune it hard. Generally, you look at the V where the branches separate out from a single branch to become two branches. And you can cut back dramatically to those junctions of the branches. I like to have about 3 nodes. So basically, I look at the primary stem, and then I'm going to pick 2 of the branches. They're going to be the primary branches. And then on each of those branches, I'm going to have another split. And on each of those branches, I'm going to have a split. Well, at some point, you don't need all of those splits. And so decide how much you want to prune the plant, and maybe 12 inches high, maybe 15 inches high, but count like 3 nodes where the leaves are going to grow. And so from that split, from that junction, just count up 3 nodes, and that's where you prune the tree. And it's going to look like a skeleton, and it's going to look like it's just a twig. That can be a very effective way for overwintering the pepper plant because it doesn't need to grow. It doesn't need a lot of leaves. You just need to give those roots protection so that next year, as the plant wakes up and starts growing again, it's already got the roots in place. And now in each of those nodes, you're going to have leaf development and you're going to have new branch development. Putting the plant into a cool location and a mostly dark location helps it enter dormancy and for the most part stay in dormancy. That's very difficult for most of us because we're going to be doing the overwintering indoors in household temperatures, and it's going to be warm enough that the plant may try to send out some new leaves. That's okay. Don't try to grow a pepper plant for production. Just keep it cool, keep it mostly dark, keep the soil from being overly saturated, and hopefully that'll help you get through the winter. And then as soon as it wakes up in spring, as soon or even in late winter, if you see it start waking up, yes, at that point you do need to keep the soil moist. You do need to keep the plant from dying out, from desiccating to the point, because it wants to send energy to those new leaves. So it's going to pull it from the roots. And if that energy isn't there, then that branch that you took all that effort in pruning is going to die. So you don't want those branches dying. But it can be quite severe. And so not knowing what exactly you've done on your other 2 attempts, be tough. It's kind of a tough love situation. And hopefully it'll be enough to get you to the point where you're having that success that you want. And I haven't really had a purpose for overwintering the peppers because every year I try something new and I take advantage of the new varieties. But this year, some of the Hungarian peppers that I'm growing, I really like. And so I'm going to be overwintering some of those to see how well they're going to do the next year. And that's why I'll be making a video if I ever get around to it. The time is about nigh for me to be doing that. The temperature is just still so warm, and I want the fruit to develop that I'm holding off the overwintering for as long as possible. Keep your fingers crossed. Wasabi Gal says, can mum survive a zone 3 to 4 winter? You should be able to find varieties that can handle that. I know the mums I have are good for zones 4 and 5. And if that's all you can find, or typical zone 4 and 5 mums, then extra protection. And this is the same idea that I was talking about with the raspberries and the strawberries, is just extra mulch. You can actually put mulch on top. Those mums are going to die back when the cold weather comes. And so you can prune off all the dead branches and just cover them with a nice thick layer of mulch. And when we talk about zones going into the winter, we're talking about the air temperature. And so for me, in my zone 5 garden, that means the zone 5A gets down to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about minus 29 Celsius. And so zone 4 is 10 degrees colder than that. And 3 is 10 degrees colder than that. So it's primarily a concern for trees, for fruit trees, for the bushes, for those plants that are going to have branches exposed to those extreme temperatures. Can the branch of an apple tree survive the temperature in a zone 3 or zone 4? That's really the issue. But for those perennials that are in the ground and that are dying back to the ground, it's not as big a concern. The ground is going to freeze. And so the ground temperature is going to be 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius, give or take a little bit. I mean, there might be minor variations in that, but frozen ground has a relatively consistent temperature. Even though the outside air in a zone 4 garden might get down to minus 30, minus 35 Celsius, the soil is not minus 30 Fahrenheit. The soil is 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And so as long as you're protecting the crown of the plant, the part that might be exposed to those extremely cold temperatures, then the plant's going to survive. And so perennial plants that might not be technically suitable for your climate and for your zone, if you cover them going into winter so that the plant itself is not exposed to those extreme temperatures, then yeah, they can survive the winter. And mums definitely fall into that category. Just do a little bit extra mulching after the plants die back, and you're ready to go. And this is a great fall activity. This is one of those gardening tasks to take place in fall. Cleaning up the garden is a fall time activity or a springtime activity. And I do both depending on the plants. You can take all those dead plants that were killed off or have gone dormant due to the cold temperatures of fall, cut them back to the appropriate point. For many of our perennials, it's all the way down to the ground, and you're done. You're preparing that plant for winter. Or you can wait until springtime and let those plants stay up. So for me, it depends on the plant. If it's a flower that produces seeds, I'll often leave it in place over the course of the winter so the birds can feed on some of those seeds. But if it's a plant that doesn't have seeds that bird eats, or it just falls down and looks pretty ragged, I'm going to clean that plant up. After the plants are cleaned up is a great time to mulch. So many gardeners are doing their cleanup in spring and they're doing their mulching in spring. Well, if you now do your cleanup in fall and do your mulching in fall, you're taking care of some of this protection that I was just talking about. You're protecting some of those plants going into winter so that if you do have some extremely cold temperatures, the plants have already been cleaned up. There's nothing above ground. They've already been covered by mulch. Anything that was close to above ground is now got that insulation of the mulch. And now you can rest easy going into the winter. That comes springtime, you've got very little to do. And all the plant has to do to reward you is pop up some new sprouts and begin growing. And in most cases, that's exactly what's going to happen. So I like to use this time of year. And when I say this time of year, I mean like October for me here in Colorado, because the days are still warm enough for me to get outside and get a lot of work done. I don't like going out in December and January and working in the garden. I like being in the garden. I don't like working in the garden in those severe cold conditions. So I try to get all that stuff done while the days still allow me to get it done. And you can do that with your plants. Asparagus is a good example of something that we're growing in our vegetable garden. Some of my asparagus plants are starting to turn brown. Temperatures are decreasing, the plant is done, the photosynthesis is beginning to shut down. And so we let the asparagus spears grow to turn into those nice ferny fronds for feeding the roots. But once that process is complete, you can cut those asparagus plants all the way down to the ground. And you can actually do it early. As soon as you notice that they're starting to change color, go out on a cold day and just chop them off. Pull up any weeds. I've got a lot of weeds growing in my asparagus bed right now. And then mulch the asparagus going into winter. You don't have to worry about that bed at all until all of a sudden you're harvesting the asparagus in early spring. So a lot of what we're doing in the garden, I think, will benefit from the fall activities to actually get everything ready to go. And so take advantage of it. Absolutely. Take advantage of it if you can. Dusty Flats says, I'm freaking out how the black raspberries are leaping. Seriously, the branches are monsters. Third year. Good for you. And so another great activity when we talk about what to do in the garden, depending on the type of raspberries you have, is you can prune back your raspberries. If it's the type of raspberry, a summer bearing variety that is going to fruit early in the year on the second year canes, on the flora canes, then you can prune off the tips in fall. You can get the plant ready to go for next year. If it's a fall bearing variety like my heritage raspberries, and they fruit on the first year, the prima cane, then you can chop those down all the way to the ground, just like the asparagus, and then add some mulch to help protect the crowns going into a cold winter, and just wait for spring when they're going to pop back up again. So that's actually very high on my list right now. My raspberries, actually ate a raspberry yesterday. I'm just starting to harvest my raspberries later than normal, but one of the reasons they're a little bit later than normal is because I didn't do the pruning that I should have done last year, and the plants struggled. I had the raspberry cane borer that I've mentioned before, and that really stressed a lot of my plants. So this year, I'm going to chop them back to the ground as soon as I have the opportunity, which is probably a month from now. But that's a good fall activity to get everything ready to go. Shandy said, I have June-bearing strawberries that are still green. Can I start my garlic in between them and then move the surviving strawberry crowns in the spring? Yes, I would be careful about that because strawberry roots can actually go deeper than you might think. It's a relatively shallow root, but if it's growing with the garlic, if you're digging up the strawberries and transplanting them in spring, just be careful about interfering with the garlic that is also growing in spring too. So in your effort to dig up a strawberry for transplanting, you might disrupt the bulb of the garlic, and that can affect how the garlic grows. But yes, for starting garlic in fall, start it wherever you want. And with the strawberries that are are spaced so that you can put the garlic in between them. Yeah, now's a great time to do that. And you can do that with garlic in any part of your garden. When the other plants have room around them for a garlic or clove to go in, put the garlic clove in. Even if it's not a garlic that you're planning to harvest, garlic is kind of a nice looking plant. You can grow that all around the garden. So yes, it is something to do. I would just be careful about the actual transplanting in spring so you don't disrupt the garlic if at all possible. And that way, both plants will actually do pretty well. The LR978 says, when you mention to someone that your garden is started from seed, they are super impressed. Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I look at almost all the plants that I have growing in my garden, and that's my pollinator garden. That's my orchard where I've got some plants that are growing now. It's my vegetable garden area. Almost all of those plants I started from seed. All my perennial flowers I started from seed. The only plants that I have that I didn't start from seed are the fruit trees and the fruit bushes. And even the asparagus I planted bare root. Even the strawberries I planted bare root. From my perspective, that's just like starting from seed. You're not buying a potted plant. So I am impressed with myself for having started so much from seed. So I would agree with you. That is one of those things that when you grow from seed, it shows that you're taking that extra effort and you really are trying to design a garden around your abilities, and you are improving your abilities to actually get to that point. So yeah, I'm impressed anytime someone tells me that they are growing from seed, because I think it is one of those things that uh, that benefits everything in the garden. And if you want to brag about it, brag about it. Absolutely. Petra says, I start to practice chop and drop in the season and fall wise. Uh, or not? Your take. Okay. So I do a lot of chop and drop. So when I talk about the pruning of my perennial plants, like taking them down to the ground and then covering with mulch, I'm almost always doing a chop and drop. If the plant is brown, I do a chop and drop. If I'm cleaning up like my vegetable garden bed, so if I'm pulling out my cucumber vines. That's way too much to chop and drop. So I will take those cucumber vines. I'll take my tomato plants. I'll take the squash plants and I'll put them in the compost pile. But for the flowers, whether they're annual or perennials, I wait until they turn brown. I will often collect the seed, like I said, and spread it around or save it to swap with the gardeners in my garden club, or I'll leave it for the birds. Whenever it's time to clean up those plants, I get out there with my secateurs, with my pruners, and cut it into small pieces and just let all those dried pieces fall to the ground as mulch. So then when I add mulch on top of it, I actually just have a double layer of mulch. It's the plants that I've chopped and dropped, and then it's mulch on top of that. And I think fall is a great time of year to do that. And like I said, I do it when the plant is brown, when it's either dead or dormant. But you could do it when it's green. You can absolutely, if the plant is finished, you can go ahead and cut it and let it fall to the ground as a green chop and drop. It's just typically we're doing a lot of the chop and drop as brown plants, but fall, absolutely. I do most of my chop and drop in fall, beyond a doubt. Absolutely. Aaron's asking, I'm a new gardener and have about 90 gallons of potting soil in my grow bags. Cool. All that soil won't fit in my shed. What's the best way to store them so I can revitalize in spring? And so um, most grow bags are actually quite durable. And I've got some grow bags on my deck right now that have been outside. They're big grow bags with soil in them. And so they're kind of heavy to move. So I just leave them in place. and they've already been out for 2 winters. This will be the 3rd winter that those grow bags have just been sitting on my deck. So depending on how big the grow bags are, I just leave them in place, especially for the big ones, and they're showing no signs of deteriorating. And then in spring, I just boost the soil a little bit, revitalize it for the plants to grow for the next season. You can just stack them. I've got 3 different sizes of grow bags. And so if you don't want to just leave them out wherever you have them growing, and 90 gallons of um, potting soil in the grow bags is a lot. If you're growing in 3-gallon pots, that's 30 grow bags. That's a pretty nice number to have. Pretty cool that you're growing so much in grow bags. If you've got different sizes, it's easier, where you put a big grow bag on the bottom and a medium-sized grow bag inside of it, and a smaller grow bag with the soil on top of that, and just stack them against the shed on the outside. If the shed's not big enough, you can still put them near the shed and in the sun or outside the sun. It really doesn't matter much. I would probably suggest take it out of the sun, just so you don't have any extra UV damage on those grow bags. But you can just stack them against the shed, or leave them in place wherever you have your soil, like the actual potting mix that you're going to be using to revitalize it. I would suggest try to store them near that. So if your shed is where you have your tools, if your shed is where you have your potting bench, if the shed is where you put your soil bags, then go ahead and stack the grow bags near your shed, so that when it comes time to revitalize, they're right there, and you don't have to wander all the way around the garden to get to that revitalization. Basically, everything's in one place. And when it comes time to get them ready for planting, you can do it all at once. And I think that kind of makes it a little bit easier when you look at it from that perspective. Sandy's asking, how do I know when the leaves I saved from last year are ready to put in my garden as organic matter? So you can put leaves in your garden at any point as organic matter. If you're talking about the decomposition of them. So for instance, I have a bag of dried leaves from last year that I have in my shed. And I use those leaves as mulch to mix with straw and dried grass primarily. Those leaves look the same today as they did a year ago. They're not breaking down. They're dry. They're staying dry. And I will use them as dried leaves that I can crush to whatever size I want. If you've saved the leaves like in a pile or in a bag where you were watering it so that they would break down to create leaf mold, if that's the purpose of your question, then same basic idea. When it is decomposed to a point that you can add it to your soil, then add it to your soil. And fall is a great time to amend your soil. I do almost all of my soil amending in fall. Leaves that are even just partially broken down, if you put them into the soil in fall, the moist soil, the fungi in the soil, the organisms in the soil are going to start breaking down those leaves. Now, if you live in a region where the ground freezes, all of that decomposition is going to start. But as soon as the soil warms up in spring, it's all going to start up again. So they may not be fully decomposed in springtime when you're ready for planting, if you're putting in bigger, chunkier pieces of leaves. But if you're waiting until the leaves are mostly decomposed, like leaf mold, and I showed this, actually have a short, I talk about it in a video, but on one of the shorts on my channel, I show the leaf mold, actual decomposition of the pile. And when it's small pieces, that's when I add it to my soil as a primary amendment with leaf mold. So you can do it at any phase. You can do it at any size. It really comes down to why you're adding the leaves. And what size you want for the organic matter. And so typically when we're talking about organic matter, we're thinking like compost, where it's mostly decomposed. So in that case, wait until the leaves are mostly decomposed. But you don't. You can actually crush them up, run them through a lawnmower or a leaf blower till they're just little itty bitty pieces. And that's easy to do when they're dry. And then go ahead and dig them into the soil as an amendment when they're just little bits of leaf. And that's a good way to add that type of organic matter to the soil. When we talk about organic matter in fall for your soil, compost, of course, rises to the top. Compost is just about the best thing you can add to your soil. But you can add the rough ingredients. And so I've shown this in some of my videos, and sometimes I do it in fall. Sometimes I do it in spring. A lot of it depends on the weather and whether it's too cold to be working outside. But all those beds that I use the crushed leaves and the grass and the straw as a mulch during the growing season, I'll turn that into the soil. So I'll take my garden fork and I'll just take a big scoop and turn it upside down. And now that organic matter, straw, leaves, and grass are buried in the soil in usually October. And through October and November and early December, before my ground freezes, those beds are improving. That material is decomposing. And then come springtime, it's happening again. Now, I'm not putting my garden in until late May or early June in most cases. And by the time I put those seeds in the ground in June, or by the time I put my tomato transplants in the ground that first week of June, there's no sign of that straw, of those leaves, or of that grass because, do the math. They basically had almost 9 months, a good solid 8 months in the ground to decompose. And that's why I think fall is just a prime time. All of those organic materials, as chunky as they are or as decomposed as they are, the organisms are breaking them down. Those nutrients are being released into the soil, and there may be no sign of the actual organic matter left after 8 months, even with winter thrown in the middle. And so that's why you can really be very flexible in the organic materials that you use in fall. In spring, and I've said this before, you really want decomposed material in spring because of that time factor. You want to be putting compost into the ground as an amendment in spring and save the leaves and the straw and the grass as mulch in spring. But in fall, I put all of it in the ground and it does great. And I don't use fertilizer because I've got that organic matter that is really benefiting all the soil. Absolutely. Serena's asking, my habanada pepper plant is just starting to produce. Will the peppers be ripe by November 1st? It's in the green stalk, so can I just cover it with a tarp for winter? I can't lift. I don't know. It all depends on your climate and when you're going to get your first frost. My first frost is going to come before November 1st. So I can tell you in my garden, my peppers will not make it to November 1st. For you, you have to look at your first frost date and when that's going to happen. If your first frost date is in November or December, then it's possible that the peppers will be ripe by November 1st. You've got the entire month of October. The sunlight is going to be decreasing. That's going to slow down the production of the plant. This is one of those situations where you, for tomatoes, for peppers, for squashes, for pumpkins, cut off the growing tip and cut off any new flowers so that all the energy is going to grow or go into those fruits that are on the plant and that are developing on the plant. And so with that thought in mind, it's possible that you can get fruit or by the end of October, beginning of November. But it all comes down to your temperatures. And yeah, absolutely. You can cover a green stalk with a tarp. Green stalk actually sells covers that are designed to fit the green stock. They're round and they're tall, and you just slide the whole thing over. And so you can find those on green stock and use the Gardener Scout code and get a discount when you're buying things like that at green stock. I have those protective covers for my green stock. And as I go into this time of year, if I've got plants that I want to keep growing and the weather's going to get cool, I throw one of those weather protectors over my green stock, and it absolutely helps. But they only help for a few degrees. Once the temperature gets cold enough, even with a tarp, even with the green stock covers, peppers are going to be killed. If it's cold enough for your ground to be frozen, it's cold enough to kill the pepper. The question is just how long you can delay that process to be able to harvest the fruit that you want to harvest. So give it a try and see what can actually happen in your area with your climate, with your plants. And that's really the best way that you can figure it out. I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about this background today. This comes from Joseph Lambert. And thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. Last week, we were talking about sound in the garden and turning your garden into a happy place, a peaceful spot, a spot with no stress. And so look at Joseph's garden. And I tried counting and I lost track, but look at all the wind chimes. We were talking about wind chimes last week and what a nice aspect they can add to the garden. Well, Joe likes his wind chimes. There's a wind chime here, and there's some bells here, and there's a wind chime there, 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 and there's a wind chime back here. I just think that's amazing. This is one of those kind of gardens, I want to go into everybody's garden. I can always learn, of course. I talk about that all the time, but imagine sitting in this garden when it's windy out and just the the orchestration of the wind chimes that you're enjoying. I think that's just a fascinating idea. And as I look at Joe's garden, it just leads my imagination as far as what his garden sounds like. For most of the gardens we see in a book or online, we imagine what the garden looks like when everything is in bloom or when all of the vegetable plants are in production. But we rarely imagine what a garden sounds like. And this is one of the first gardens that I look at and think, I wonder what that garden sounds like. Now, of course, you can see all the plants that are growing throughout the garden. And then I love all different types of hardscape and designs that you can see in the garden. And so there's a lot packed in here visually and then that sound component. It's really intriguing to me as to what this all sounds like. And so if you haven't thought about that, even after last week when we spent so much time talking about the sounds of the garden, I think this was a good. I wanted this to be a good idea for the background today to tie into to some of what we were talking about last week, where you can design your garden however you want to design your garden. And if the sound is something that you haven't considered, think about it. I talked about my wind chimes and the sounds that I have in my garden, and they pale in comparison to what Joe has. And so it's just something that, and why I like sharing all of your gardens so much as a background. It's something that you can add that maybe you didn't even think you could add, that just adds a whole new element to your enjoyment of the garden. So thank you for this, Joe. Of course, there's all the beautiful plants, and I don't want to take away from the plants. You can see all the pots that are lined up, a lot of container growing. You can see there's actually a green stalk over my shoulder with plants growing in it, in addition to all the low plants and things that are growing in the background. But the chimes just stand out so much that I just really think this is a really nice accent to a garden. So thank you for that. And it is one of those things, like Ruth Ann says, I have several wind chimes and buoy bells. I love them. Absolutely. And Mobius says bamboo chimes are lovely mellow sound. I love bamboo chimes. So think about that as you're coming up with your plan for next year. And back to the idea of fall planning. Fall is the time I'm planning things like this. Fall's the time of year that you really have opportunity to see the structure of your garden. Once those plants start dying, once you start cleaning up the beds, once you put all that new mulch in place, after the beds are amended, and everything is just sitting. There's nothing growing anymore. It's just sitting. It's a great time to walk through the garden and plan for next year. Are you going to put new beds in? Are you going to put some wind chimes in? What plants are you going to put in? Do you have a sitting area? Have you thought about the sitting area? Where's the sitting area going to go? Fall is a great time to walk through a quiet garden. It's not going to take you any more time. You've been spending time taking care of the garden. So take that same time after the plants no longer need to be cared for and walk through the garden. Listen to your garden. Let your garden speak to you. And then make note of that for next year. And while the weather's good, you might be able to put some of that in place so that come springtime, when everything suddenly ramps up and you're planting and you're weeding and you're getting the garden awake, you don't have to worry about the actual building of the garden because you took care of that in fall. So I've got a bunch of projects right now that are going on. I've been working on the fence that I've mentioned that's going around my greenhouse. I've added another stone bed. I'm doing a lot of work right now that is not taking care of plants because my plants don't need as much work. Some of them are fading. I'm in the throes of harvesting delicious tomatoes, but I'm taking advantage of the normal time that I would be out actively working in the garden, doing some of those other fall time activities. And so, what's on your list? Was there something you were saving for next year that really could be done in fall? And that might be one of those ways to take advantage of this time. Tony's saying, time to do all those ideas you've had all year. Get on it. Yeah, exactly my point. There were a lot of things I wanted to get done in the garden this year that didn't get done because there was just too much going on with the planting and everything else. Well, now they're getting done. So those projects for next year, I'm trying to move them up to get them done in fall. Absolutely. And you could do the same thing. It's the smart use of your time over a long period of time so that you don't have to get everything all at once. If you're new to gardening, and if you followed my advice where you start small and figure out what you like and what you don't like and what works and what doesn't work, then fall's the time to expand. If you've had a growing season as a brand new gardener and you learned a ton, well, put all that you learned to practice and add another bed, add 2 beds, add 3 beds. Whatever your journey is going to be, start getting on that path and expanding your garden in fall. The beds, raised beds in particular, that we build in spring and then we fill in spring are really not ready for growing in spring. That soil is essentially sterile in most cases. There's not a lot of life to it. And so when you put plants in, they may struggle in that first year because that soil doesn't have the development yet, doesn't have all those nutrients. But like I was talking about earlier, with all the time on your side, that same bed that you build in October and fill in October is more than ready for planting in May and June. So that's my preferred method for getting the garden built and expanded. And I suggest you consider that. Brian, thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. Have a good week, everyone. Stay well. I hope you are well, my friend. And I hope everything is going to be well moving into the change of seasons for you as well. So thank you for being here, Brian, and I do appreciate your support for so long. Okay, let's see. I'm clicking on this. I just lost it. Jay, there we go. Jay says autumn is a great time to build, move compost, chop leaves for many uses, build garden beds, and more. You said it. It's just so true. And this is really a good point. And I had it on my list, but I hadn't talked about it yet. Is starting compost pile. Start a compost pile. We talk a lot about compost and how good compost is. If you're a new gardener, if you're a small gardener, you might not have a compost pile. Fall is a perfect time to start your compost pile. You've got a lot of organic matter just waiting to be used. You still have some green plants that will be that good green nitrogen source. You've got leaves, you've got dead plants that can be that brown carbon source. And so, as far as the best time of year to really get a compost pile started, fall just really can't be beat, because in your yard, in your garden, you probably have everything you need to start a really good compost pile. And you've got the time, so do it. It's going to follow that same basic pattern I was talking about earlier with the soil organisms. You can do the slow composting method where you just pile everything and just wait for it to decompose. But even in winter, if you want to get out and turn your pile, you can have compost very quickly. So if you start a pile in October and you actually keep it moist and keep it oxygenated and monitor the temperatures, you can easily be harvesting compost in November. And if the weather's still good enough for you and the ground hasn't frozen, use that compost that you just made yourself in those beds that you're going to be amending in fall. So, yeah, absolutely, it's a great time to do all of that. And takes a little bit of work, sure, but the benefits are definitely going to be something that I think you'll enjoy. Tony, of course, an expert in composting, says it's not a garden without a compost pile. It's the way you recycle and return the nutrients back to the soil. It's the cycle of life, folks. Well said, Tony. They when I design my garden, so every time I've moved and started a new garden, the compost pile was the first thing I put in place. If you go back to the videos of where I live now and I moved 5 years ago, you'll see that the compost pile, my pallets were there before almost all the beds were in place. So I think I built a bed, then I built the compost pile, or the compost bins, then I went back to building beds. And so nothing in my garden but one bed and the compost pile. I didn't have anything to put in the compost pile at that time, but as the organic matter came available, I added it to the compost pile. Now I've got more organic matter and it makes it much easier to have a compost pile. But even in the beginning with really nothing, because I have no trees, I had no plants growing, but I had a compost pile. That's how important I think it is to have a compost pile in your garden, is to have it there before you even use it. So when you're ready to use it, it's already done. Okay, John, Ron, or Jan, Ron, and Arthur, thank you very much, moderators. And Scott, it's always appreciated. I'm quiet today because I'm slammed at work, but I enjoyed listening. Well, thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Yeah, absolutely. Shout out to Heidi and to Jay. And Heidi won't be with us next week. I hope everything goes well with your appointment, Heidi. So I look forward to hearing back from you when you join us back. I do want to say, primarily for Heidi, but for all of you as well, that there will not be a show in 2 weeks. So on the 14th of October, I'll actually be traveling and there will not be a show. So I'll have a show next week, October 7th, and then I'll be back 2 weeks later on October 21st. So we're actually going to miss Heidi for 2 weeks because she won't be here next week, and then we won't have a show the week after that. So when you get back, Heidi, I'm hoping everything will have gone well, and all of us will be okay after having missed a week. And of course, I'll remind everybody next week, and I'll send out some notices so that you don't inadvertently show up and wonder where I'm at. And it's all good. I get to go visit my son and his family in Louisiana, and of course, I look forward to that every opportunity I get. And October's the time of year that I'm doing it. So thank you, Jay, for posting that as a reminder. And hopefully everyone will be back on the 21st ready to go. Bettina says, first thing we did in our newly built house and bare property, put in a compost pile. Had nothing but builder soil and mud, but that pile was ready for the following year's garden. Good on you. That's the way to do it. I love it. The initial location. So I'm trying to think back to the last 3 gardens I've had where I put the compost pile right away was where the compost pile ended up. Now, as I'm building out this garden, I put the compost pile in its initial spot, and I'm gonna move it. The reason I'm going to move it is because I have a 2-bin compost system right now, and I actually want to have a 3-bin compost system. And so I'm going to move it to a new location closer to the main area of my garden so that I can put in that 3rd bin and have it closer to where all the plants are actively growing. But most of the time, if you just stop and think and have that vision of what your garden's going to look like, you can put that compost pile in the beginning, and you're going to be right. Everything is going to grow up around it. You're going to have the material to add to it, and it's all going to be good. And I could leave my compost where it is and just add a 3rd bin, but I think it will actually be more efficient if I move it closer to my vegetable garden. Because right now it's just behind my pollinator garden, and that worked. I could still move my wheelbarrow back and forth, but as my garden gets built out, putting it close to where the plant material comes from is actually going to save me a few steps, and I think it'll save me a few wheelbarrow loads along the way. So that's why my plan has changed as far as that is concerned. So Merit M4 says, last year I had a compost pile, but the mice were living in it. I had to remove it because the mice started coming into the church where my garden is located. Ooh, I'm sorry to hear that. So I know that I have mice in my compost pile, but I also have 2 dogs now. And, you know, protect your ears if you don't want to hear this, but Mala and Lika were fighting over a mouse that I think they had found in the compost pile this last week. So I took the mouse away from them. But it's that time of year that compost piles tend to be warmer on cool nights. And so if you have vermin, they might find their way to the compost pile. That is a reality of compost. Unless it's well enclosed, that could be an issue. When you have dogs like mine, it's not as big an issue, but certainly do be aware of it. With vermin, one of the things you can do is actively manage that pile. If you're at 160 degrees Fahrenheit, 71 Celsius in your pile, that's too hot for a mouse. And so you being out there to get that heat, you're going to be turning your pile, you're going to be caring for the pile. That's also too much activity for mice. And so you can mitigate some of those vermin issues just by tending to the compost pile on a more regular basis. If not, if you're okay with trapping, that's another option. You can still have compost and put traps for those mice, and that also should mitigate the problem to a certain degree. Lily says we have lots of mice, but I think they're so cute. So they are cute, and I won't chase mice. when I see them, because I don't necessarily want to draw attention to them for my dogs. But yeah, I like watching the mice that are wandering around the garden. I don't like it when they're in the beds. I do take action there, but around the pile, sure, absolutely. Nathan's asking anything that shouldn't go into the compost: old tomato vines, cucumber vines, pepper plants, etc. So as far as the plants are concerned, I pretty much put everything in the compost pile. Now, my garden does not have disease. Knock on wood again, I've been able to keep diseases out of my garden. So I can put tomato plants and pepper plants and cucumber vines and all those things in my compost pile. Even like right now, my zucchini has powdery mildew. It hasn't spread to other plants, but I'm going to put those zucchini plants in my compost pile. Powdery mildew is passed by a spore. It's all around us. By not putting it in my compost pile, I am not keeping my garden from getting powdery mildew next year. It's going to happen. The compost, even if a squash plant that has powdery mildew on the leaves is composted, all of that compost is being put into the soil. And then that soil is being covered by mulch. So any spores for powdery mildew that might be in that compost that didn't get killed, they're buried. So they're not going to find their way to the leaves. So for many of the diseases that we have in our garden, if they're airborne diseases and you compost that plant and then bury that compost, you're not spreading that disease. But for those diseases that are spread through the soil, then that's what we don't put in our compost. We don't put diseased tomato plants that have a soil-borne disease. The tomato plants, the pepper plants, anything that has a soil-borne disease, don't compost those. Throw them away, identify that bed, and try to isolate it and not grow the same species of plants again, to try to mitigate the disease issues and hopefully eradicate any potential problems. But other than that, I compost pretty much everything. You'll see the advice, quote unquote, not to compost tomatoes. It's because the fear of disease is so strong that the advice is just don't compost it and you will never have disease. Well, I think that's too limiting. That's why I focus on what type of disease it is. And if it's not going to be harmful, if it's buried as a soil amendment and the bacteria are going to feed on it, then I'll still compost it. And I'm okay with that. The leaves as from the trees, same thing. They're okay to add. Even, if this is one of those things, and you kind of have to take it for your own philosophy. But my brother-in-law has a company that sprays his lawn with herbicides to keep the weeds down. Typically, that stops in mid to late summer. And then he has a tree that drops leaves. And his leaves are one of the sources of leaves that I have in my garden. And so when the leaves fall from his tree onto the treated grass, I'm okay collecting those leaves because the lawn hasn't been sprayed in a couple months. It's dissipated, and the likelihood of any residue that's still on those lawn grass blades getting onto the leaves, negligible, probably zero. So I collect those leaves. It's those kind of considerations where you just have to figure out the process, particularly of herbicides, and whether they would be a problem in your determination of whether you use something in your compost pile. And so even if some of those leaves might have some herbicide residue, by the time they go through the composting process, it's not going to be an issue either. So unless you have a problem that will carry through the composting process to pose additional problems later on, like those soil-borne diseases and your pile isn't hot enough to kill the pathogens, I would keep those out. Everything else, yeah, it goes in the pile. Everything else goes into the pile. Rotten fruit, leftover fruit, everything goes into the compost pile. Absolutely. Merit M4. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Glad I found your channel, Gardener Scott. Thanks from Bakersfield. Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And I'm glad that you found my channel too. I'm glad you could be here today. That's so fantastic. There are so many people that we have on this network, this community, that have been here for years, and some who've only been here for a few days. It really is great that we can all get together and share this time together on our Mondays as we talk about all the things. There are so many other things that I wanted to talk about today that I didn't get to. I actually have 2 videos from 4 years ago where I talk about the very specific gardening tasks that I do in fall. And I'm sure Jay is already starting to look for them. And so 2 videos, I did them back to back. Each one has 15 different tasks that I do in the fall. And we've talked about many of them, from the seed saving to the amending, to the collecting of the leaves, to the cleanup of the bed. But there's a lot more in those 2 videos if you want to follow up. And after this video goes to the review phase, I'll try to get on and I'll link those videos at the end. So if you're watching on review and you want to click on those videos, I don't normally link videos at the end of these live streams, but I'll go ahead and add those 2. It'll take a couple hours for YouTube to get this fully published for me to do that. But I'll go ahead and add those so you can actually see the 30 different things. Among them are things like tools. Put your tools away, sharpen your tools, clean your tools. There's the activity in spring that we do in spring. And so much of that is kind of like catching up for all the things we didn't do in fall. Tools are one of those kind of things. We clean our tools, we get our tools ready to go in spring because we didn't do it in fall. If you get everything cleaned and sharpened and oiled in fall, then you just hang it on the pegs or put on your shelf wherever your tools are. And when you need them next year, they're all ready to go. That's one less thing to do in spring. So I like to kind of look at it that way. You're really not making extra effort. It's effort you would have to make anyway for all these fall tasks. You're just shifting the time of year that you're doing a lot of these activities. And there you go, Jay. Thank you so much for that. There's the one. Should you clean up your garden in fall? Talking about the cleanup in addition to some of the other fall time activities. The calendar does direct much of what we do. Even like I talked about early on, if you live in a region where maybe you don't really get winter, I talk about my brother in Arizona, they cool down in winter. Well, fall actually becomes the time of year for planting. So if you live in a region where it's too hot in the summer to actually have a full-fledged vegetable garden, fall may actually be the time to start planting your vegetable garden because you can grow it through the winter months. It's going to grow very slowly because the sun isn't going to be as high in the sky, but you can have your vegetable garden in winter as opposed to the vegetable garden in summer. And so consider that. If that's something that you just say, I can't garden because it's too hot in the summer, well, can you do it in the winter? Maybe you have to be very selective with your plants. You might get cold enough that you can only grow spinach and beets and Swiss chard and all the brassicas, but that's a long list of plants that you can still grow. You might not be able to do the tomatoes and the peppers during your winter, but maybe you can. So add that to your list of the fall time activities, and you might be able to garden year round, literally, just depending on what it is you want to grow. Thank you, Lily. I do appreciate that. I look forward to your live chats on Mondays. And as I say every week, I look forward to it as well. So thank you, Lily. I appreciate you and have appreciated you for so long. Thank you so much for that. I do want to give a shout out to Janelle. Today is Janelle's birthday. She's may not be watching, but if Janelle happens to be watching, I want to give a very special happy birthday to you. And I hope that it's just a fantastic day and a fantastic year ahead. And birthdays are one of those days that generally we celebrate for someone else. We don't always celebrate a birthday for ourselves. And so I think it's important to identify for those people that are special in their lives, that they are special in our lives. And we do the little bit that we can to make the day a little extra special. So thank you, Sandy, and to all the others. And thank you, Liz, for saying happy birthday to Janelle, and for all the rest of you that might also want to wish her a happy birthday as we finish up the show today. I think that gardener energy, last week when I was talking about the energy within our gardens and how we find that special spot that brings us peace or happiness or special calm, I think there is an energy connected to gardening. However metaphysical it might be, who knows? But I also think there's just this bond and this energy that we gardeners have as we share this gardening journey with each other. And that garden energy just goes out into the universe and makes the universe a much happier place. So thank you to all of you for those birthday wishes. And I'm guessing that Janelle is picking up on the brain waves, and right now is probably just feeling a little bit warmer and a little bit happier. And it's all because of us. Next week, we're going to do this again. Remember, in the week after we won't. So I'll try to think of something special next week, kind of a double impact show so that there's lots of good information going forward. I hope your week is good. I hope the weather is good for you and you're able to get some of these fall time activities started, or at least planned, so that you can do next month if that fits your schedule a little bit better. But all along the way and every day, it really comes down to one thing, and that's to enjoy gardening. I'll see you next week.